Welcome back, Woods people, and to another session of Back Porch Forestry. I'm Dr. David Merker, Extension Forester with the University of Tennessee. As you can tell, we're not on the back porch today. At the time of this filming, it's about 20 degrees out. It's in December. I don't know when this will be released, but right now it's too cold to sit on the back porch. So we've come into the man cave today. We've got a visitor. Tom is going to keep his watchful eye over us today. This will be an abbreviated session. Typically, we strive for a 30-30 that you're familiar with, but this will be a little bit shorter today. We're discussing firewood, I suppose, an appropriate topic for a day like today. So I encourage you to kind of don your favorite vest, your warmest vest, maybe a hot beverage, and settle in as we discuss the topic of firewood today. Firewood as a forest management tool. This particular topic and this presentation really is a summary of this publication right here. Dr. Adam Taylor is our wood product specialist with the University of Tennessee. And he and I developed this publication early in 2020. And so if you're interested in going into greater detail, I encourage you to find this publication on the internet. I'll have a site, a web address at the conclusion of this presentation. We're just going to kind of take a cursory look at this topic today, firewood harvesting as a forest management tool. By way of introduction, a lot of people may not realize it, but firewood is a major use of wood harvested globally. When we want to increase the heat in our homes, we just go up to the thermostat and click the button a little bit, or anymore we do it from our recliner. But around the world, that's not the case. Many people have to heat with wood, and they still cook with wood. And so it is a major natural resource that's used globally. There are many benefits, of course, burning wood. We all like the fact that it's comfortable. We just like the ambiance of a fire. It is also something that's local. We might not think about that with firewood, but typically we don't cut firewood and ship it halfway across the continent. It tends to stay local, which is important. We hear a lot about local consumption of fruits and vegetables, and firewood is in the same boat. And then it is also carbon neutral. And what I mean by that, even though carbon is emitted when the wood is burned, carbon can recycle back into trees because trees are renewable. And as long as we are growing trees and managing them in a sustainable manner, and we are in Tennessee and at least the eastern United States, we can be confident that carbon is cycling back into trees. So we're improving the environment, at least addressing the global warming issue when it comes to that. And also, the other benefit is by harvesting firewood from a forest, you can improve its condition. And what I mean by that is many of our forests, as I have alluded to in the past, hardwood forests anyway, have been mismanaged. They've been harvested improperly, either through high grading or diameter limit cutting, and they are in need of improvement practices. And so firewood harvesting addresses this issue. This is what we call timber stand improvement, TSI. And TSI is a practice of improving the composition, the stocking, and the growth of a forest. So which tree species are present, what is their stocking level, and what is their growth rate? And firewood harvesting helps us to achieve an optimum level of this. So basically, the steps are pretty simple. We're trying to first identify the crop trees. Now, what I mean by crop trees aren't firewood trees. These are the trees that we're going to grow into the future for timber harvesting, for the production of wood for lumbering. So we identify those trees that have good potential first, and then we find the competing trees adjacent to them that we either kill or, in this case, remove as firewood, harvest as firewood, to release the crowns of the crop trees. And we like to do that on probably a minimum of 2 sides, but preferably 3 or 4 sides of that tree to get the greatest growth response. And so the growth response on these crop trees that we're leaving, the residuals, we'll first see that growth response in the roots, and then it's carried onto the branches. In other words, the tips of the branches growing more leaves, foliage, and then it ends in trunk expansion or girth expansion. And so to demonstrate that, I come back to one of those oldies but goodies, a photo that I typically refer back to. And you can see the growth response by observing the growth rings. And you'll see that the tree was suppressed at this point. The growth rings were very close together. Here's where the release occurred, whether it's by firewood or other method. In this case, I'm just assuming that it was firewood that released the tree. And you'll see the increased growth response until such point that the crown closes up again and it shuts down essentially. So that's what you can do by removing firewood from your forest. You can increase the growth rate on the desirable future crop trees. So looking at it kind of in the form of a figure aerially, you can see there are 6 different crop trees in this picture. And you'll notice the trees without leaves are the firewood trees, those that can be taken out. So we're not eliminating all the trees, we're just eliminating those that are in direct competition with our crop trees and using them for firewood. Now, naturally, you can't go into your forest and do all of it in 1 year, but if you do burn wood or sell wood or allow other people to do the same from your property, this can be accomplished over a series of years, 2, 3, 4 acres per year, until such time that you've gone through your entire forest and have improved it. So here's a real life example. On the right, you see a black walnut tree. Of course, we know black walnut is a highly prized and valuable tree. It has a relatively good form. There's a slight crook in it at about 8 foot high, but it's fairly straight and free of defects. Now, to the left of that tree and competing with it, in other words, the crowns are touching, is this elm tree. Elm typically is a lower value timber tree. But this tree could come out for firewood. Now, some would say, well, elm's hard to split. I'm not sure I want to make that my firewood. Well, that's true, but if it's small enough size, it doesn't have to be split, or any more people have wood splitters, and that's really not as much of an issue. So remove the elm to release the black walnut tree. Now, what constitutes a preferred crop tree? If we're going to select those trees that we want to favor in time, and free up by removal of firewood, what kind of trees are we looking for? We've addressed this in the past as species, form, and grade. Species refers to the desirable species, and we know that oaks and walnut, poplar, cherry ash, maple are all good choices in demand by the timber industry, and for the most part bring a desirable price. But in themselves, that's not enough. Just because it's a good species doesn't mean that it has good form or good grade. And so ideally we want trees with all 3 of these, species, form, and grade, because this will result in the highest residual value timber. But sometimes the species may be desirable, but the form or grade may not, in which case we might want to take those trees out for firewood. So here's an example. On the left, you'll see a tulip tree, tulip poplar tree. That's the gray or silver kind of colored tree. Good species, it's got excellent form and good grade, and so that's a tree that could be retained. It doesn't make that good a firewood anyway. That could be retained for future timber sale. And on the right, the darkened tree, closer to you, would be the red oak. This is a southern red oak, also a desirable tree. It's got good form and good grade. But I want your eyes to focus on the tree in the middle. That's a post oak tree. Now, post oak is one of the white oaks, but it's not a valuable white oak, mostly because of the color of the wood, and also typically they don't have good grade. They have a lot of knots in them. Notice this tree is forked at about head high, so this is not a desirable long-term crop tree, and is a tree that can be taken out as an excellent source of firewood because it's one of the white oaks, and free up growing space around some of these other trees. Another example, here's a white oak, again, generally a preferred tree, but this tree was actually damaged years ago when another tree fell on it. And I'm thinking this occurred when a timber harvest happened and a larger tree came down and smashed this tree at about 15 feet of height. And so at one time, the top of the tree would have laid all the way down over here. Eventually that died and fell off, but as it was recovering, it resprouted there, and there. So good species, but horrible form and grade. So that's a good candidate for a tree for firewood. And in so doing, we would release this better white oak in the background that has good form and relatively good grade as well. remove one white oak to release another white oak. Again, a white oak that really has poor grade. Notice it's just full of knots, and take a long time for those knots to cover up and begin producing good wood. And so we might cut this tree out to benefit another white oak. Now, when growing on the proper site, black cherry actually can be a very valuable tree. We generally tend to think of it more of a species that's in demand in the northeastern states, northeastern region, but it does grow in Tennessee, and particularly when you find it on a north slope like this one is, it's a desirable crop tree. So it's a good species. It's got good form. It's straight, and certainly it's clean. There's not many defects, lower branches to speak of. And it's already been freed up, and so there's not much we can actually do to that tree by way of firewood removal. So that's one that we would just retain for future timber. So sometimes we just walk away and say there's nothing to do here to improve the condition of this tree. So what we've got here, I want to show you the 10-year diameter growth response of a number of species on Appalachian sites. This is based on work that was done by Perky and published in 2001, so it's been around a while, but it's accurate. And so what we've got here are a number of species that he studied. You can see red oak, poplar, cherry, maple, white oak, scarlet oak, which is another type of red oak, as is black oak, and then chestnut, which is one of the white oaks. So we've got 8 different species, and if left alone where crop tree release or firewood removal is not conducted, what you can expect is that in 10 years, on average Appalachian sites, this is how much the tree would grow in diameter. This is diameter growth in 10 years. So you're looking at red oak would grow 2 inches in diameter in 10 years. That's not very good, very disappointing. And you look at white oak, 1.2 inches in diameter in 10 years. If we were to average all these species, we would see that they would average slightly less than 2 inches in diameter over a 10-year period. But when crop tree release is conducted, in other words, we've released the crowns of the trees, this is what happens to the growth response, the growth rate. And you see red oak has jumped from 2 inches to 3.4 inches in 10 years. And you can go down the line to the point, if you look at the overall average at the bottom, all 8 of these trees are now growing an average of 2.7 inches in diameter in 10 years. And if you were to look at them on a per species basis, what you'll see is this is the percent increase in growth by being released. And I want you to focus particularly on these 2 species here, red oak and white oak, the 2 that we're most concerned about releasing for future lumber or timber production. And notice how they're very responsive to crown touching release. Overall, if you look at the bottom line, then the average across all these species is about 50%. Some trees actually don't respond very well to crown touching release, and you'll notice black cherry is one, as well as scarlet oak. But overall, a 50% increase in growth rate is pretty phenomenal, and can help us achieve our timber production goals quicker. I want to talk just briefly about tree felling safety. That's more than what we can address thoroughly today, but obviously we're going to be using a chainsaw to be felling trees for firewood. And a couple things that I like to point out: we want our chainsaw to be sharp. You're less likely to harm yourself and get fatigued if you have a sharp chain on your saw. In addition, I like a saw that's neither too big nor too small. And so as you're standing upright, holding the saw from its handle, the tip of the nose of the bar, in other words, the very end of the saw, should hit you about at your ankle. If it's longer than that, then you're going to have to constantly lift that saw up to keep it from touching the ground. Shorter than that, it would be a lighter saw, but you don't have as much to work with, and so you might have to work harder. Obviously, we want protective equipment. That would include goggles, hearing protection, hard hats, and chaps primarily, steel-toed boots as well. So be very careful when it comes to that. And then there are tree and site hazards to consider too. And so we want to look up, out, and down. I like to say that a lot. Before I cut a tree down, I'm looking up to see where it's going to go. Look out, because that's going to tell you the direction of fall as well. And then look down, because we need to have an escape route. And so by looking up, we can determine tree lean and crown weight and where it needs to fall. By looking down, we can look at our escape route. And then also, we just want to make careful felling cuts to make sure that we're not getting sloppy with our work. Always look for widowmakers, which are dead limbs that might be in the top of a tree that you don't realize come crashing down once the tree begins to fall. Grapevines that might pull the tree a different direction as it's being cut, or something else to consider. Well, getting more into the firewood itself, there are a couple of common units of firewood measurement. Actually, the cord is the standard. You'll see on the left picture, a cord is a stack of wood that's 4 feet high, 4 feet deep, and 8 feet in length. That's the really only true measurement. Now, a rick or a face cord is an informal measurement, and essentially it represents 1/3 of a cord. So it's 4 by 8, but the depth of it is only 16 inches deep, or roughly about the depth the length that most people would want for their firewood. Sometimes, of course, it's sold by pickups, and that determines the size of the pickup bed too. So be careful with that. But the cord is the primary measurement. Now, when we look at the number of trees that it takes to make a cord of wood, and you say, well, why is that important? Well, it might not be important, but if you actually heat with wood, you probably know about how much wood you're going to need over the course of a winter. Or if you're selling wood, you want to know how many cords of wood you're going to have to sell. What we've got here is the DBH, which is the diameter at breast height in the first column, 5 inches down to 22. We've got the total tree height. In other words, a 5-inch tree that might be 40 feet tall. And it would take, if you look at the top right-hand entry there, it would take roughly 91 trees that are 5 inches in diameter and 40 feet tall to get a cord of wood. Now, let's look more specifically at an 11-inch tree. In that case, we've got 70 foot of total length, total height, and it would take 5 trees. And then we look at a 22-inch diameter tree. So it would only take one 22-inch diameter tree to equal a cord of wood. And if you came all the way up the top, we've got the equivalent of that would be a 5-inch tree. It would take 91 of those. So obviously, you're going to have a lot more work involved, perhaps with smaller diameter trees, other than the fact that they won't need splitting as much. Now, which species of trees are preferred for firewood? Well, quite simply, it's the dry ones. Essentially, all wood makes decent firewood. Some of it just requires more of it to heat, but it still burns. And so wood from any tree can be good firewood, provided it's dry. And that's what's very important here, is that we want it to be dry. Wet or green wood will tend to smolder. It will burn slowly and produce less heat because the water has to evaporate before the wood fiber can actually burn. So water doesn't burn, so the water has to be pushed out, smoldered out, essentially, in the form of smoke before it can burn. So what we've got here is the BTU provided by the moisture content of wood. And so BTU is a British thermal unit. It's a measurement of heat. And this is broken into 3 categories: green wood, which is wet, essentially, semi-dry, and then dry wood. And what I want to point out is, if we just notice this is in descending order, wood that is 60% wet versus 50-40 all the way down to fairly dry at 20% moisture content. And then look at the net heat provided by the wood according to the amount of moisture it has. And so what's interesting to point out is that the same piece of wood, if it's air dried down to 20%, will produce about almost 3 times as much net heat as will that same piece of wood that's green. So it just makes the case again that we need to get that wood dry. Obviously, it's always going to have some moisture because there's moisture, just ambient moisture in the atmosphere, whether it's in your house or even outside. It's going to have some moisture in it, but the drier, the better. Now, density matters too, and this refers to the pounds per volume of wood. And so what we've got is the wood density by kind of some select species that I've chosen here. you notice white ash, basswood, all the way down to poplar. And then on the right column, this is the density, which is the pounds of wood without the water, just the pounds of wood per cubic foot of wood. That's what that's saying is, if you envision in your mind a cubic piece of wood and it's white ash, it would weigh 34 pounds versus only 20 pounds for basswood. And on down the line, wow, look at dogwood, weighs 40 pounds. It's a very, very dense wood, and you see others too. Now, why is that important? Well, it's important for a number of reasons. Wood species vary considerably in their density. For example, let's go ahead and compare basswood with dogwood. Basswood has half the density of dogwood, thus a cord of dogwood has the capacity to produce twice as much heat as basswood. Of course, good luck finding a cord of dogwood. So most of the time, people, of course, are not going to have that much dogwood to burn. So what are some species that are available in higher quantities that have good wood density? And here's three that I've just selected, the top three performers that fall below dogwood, and that's hickory, black locust, and white oaks. These would be probably the three best choices in terms of density for getting the amount of heat, biggest bang for your buck, in other words. Now, this next tier also make excellent firewood, just not quite as good. And that would be these species right here you see coming up. The red oaks, sugar maple, American elm, cherry, and ash. All good sources, and perhaps we might want to take some of these trees out in order to favor our white oak trees. Personally, I like white ash a lot because it has high density, and in addition, it splits very easily. So it's it's generally good and straight and easy to split. So it's a species that you might want to consider for firewood, particularly as the emerald ash borer is moving into the region and killing a lot of ash trees anyway. You can get ahead of that by cutting some of your ash trees for firewood. Now, regarding ease of splitting, which I've sort of alluded to, firewood dries quicker when it has been bucked into shorter lengths. In other words, cut up into 16, 18, 20-inch lengths, whichever you prefer, and then split. And it's going to dry quicker because you've got more surface area exposed. So it's going to dry quicker than if it's left in round form and in long lengths. We know that straight grain wood splits easier too, such as ash, cherry, poplar, generally oak. These are trees that tend to split easier, so that might be a consideration for firewood. And then we want to try to let's just say that species with interlocking grain are difficult to split. Doesn't mean they can't make good firewood, particularly if you've got a firewood splitting machine. But sweet gum, elm, and hackberry are examples of trees that are a little bit more challenging to split. And so you might want to cut them out of your woods early while they're still young and smaller in diameter and not requiring much splitting. Well, a word or two on the preparation of firewood. Wood is easier to split when it's green. And so here's a case where you notice this left picture. This was a white ash tree that was felled. Actually, this is right off the back porch where I normally present these sessions. I cut this tree down and then immediately bucked it up into 16-inch lengths, and then immediately after that split it. And so you're not looking at total from start to finish here. Cut the tree down, buck it up, and split it. I probably don't have, not even an hour's worth of time in that. And then it's stacked and ready to go and stored. Good size tree, and it will be ready for burn. This was cut in early spring, and by the fall of the year, it's prime and ready to be burned. So don't cut the trees down and let them lay for a while. Try to split them quickly. Now, regarding continuing on the subject of preparation for firewood, it needs to be dried, and many people call this seasoning. But we know that drying is affected by a number of variables, and that includes the size of the pieces. So the smaller pieces that have been opened up, split, are going to dry quicker. Some species dry quicker than others. Of course, temperature plays into it. Warm temperatures will evaporate the moisture quicker, as well as considerations for humidity and rainfall. Cut the wood and split it in the spring, and then it'll be ready to dry by autumn. And then It's important to stack the woods on a surface that doesn't retain moisture. So if you look at this example, this is on pea gravel. And so that water will get away and not rot that lower tier of firewood. And also it should be sheltered so that additional rainfall doesn't fall on the wood and just replace the moisture that you're trying to dry. So it's good to have, it can be fairly crude, but some type of a shelter over the wood. Now, I kind of want to close with a real life example. And so this was a forest stand that I was trying to favor red oak in. And so we've got primarily southern red oak. That's a cherry bark red oak back there. But red oak were the trees that I'm trying to favor. And in this particular situation, we had sweet gum trees that were growing. The crowns were right up in the crowns of the red oak. And so these trees were removed, not only removed, killed, but removed from the site. And the growth response is now occurring in these red oak trees. And so it takes generally about 3 years for you to begin to see a response in the girth because, of course, as I said, it grows in the roots first and then the crowns or branch tips. And that, in turn, will eventually lead to this response in the trunk of the tree. So that kind of summarizes it for us. I always encourage you to complete the survey that's located at this site. Tell me what you think about this presentation. And here's the link, the URL for the Firewood publication that we recently developed. And so you can either click on that, or if you just Google in the title of the presentation and my or Dr. Taylor's last name, you'll find it that way. So thanks for joining me in the man cave today, and I hope that you have a pleasant day. Thank you.